Hello, everyone. This is John from Coins, RPGs, and more. I wanted to apologize for the problem with the last upload that I did. What ended up happening is I realized after I uploaded the video that I had made a grievous error in that video. And most of the time, when I've made errors in videos, I've let it stand. Not because I like having my errors up, but because I feel it's important to keep that real, so to speak. Keep it real with everyone. I make mistakes. I'm not perfect. But this one was, um, I was embarrassed enough that I took it down once I realized what had happened. And what that means for the future of the Cypher System character creation video is I'm going to reshoot it, and I'm going to. I had been already planning on making a second Cypher System character creation video anyway, so I will make a second one, and that second one will be the official one. And then what I'll do with the character I created during that video is I'll use that as a let's look at what a Cypher System character sheet looks like video. So just to give people a heads up on what's going on. But that's not what we're going to talk about with today's video, because today I had a brainstorm, and I decided this is something kind of worth talking about. And the brainstorm is all the different methods that I have encountered over the years of how to resolve the question of, does my character succeed in this task or not? And if so, how well? And that idea of resolving this thing in a somewhat random fashion is kind of the kernel of a role-playing game. It's what separates role-playing games from simply playing pretend and pointing your finger at your friend and saying, "Bam, I shot you," and your friend says, "Nuh-uh." And it goes on and on. No, I did. I totally did, because I used, I used the special, never miss laser gun. Yeah, well, I'm wearing the never penetrated armor, and blah 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 blah. It goes back and forth. And so, what we decided as a culture of role players is we need rules for this. Well, and people like Gary Gygax and Dave Amundsen and Steve Jackson and a few others that were involved in the industry in the early days kind of said, "Yeah, let's make rules for that." Well, it was much more complicated than that. I'm simplifying it to almost an insulting level. I do apologize. I do not intend to do that. It's just too much to go into for one short-ish video. So, but let's talk about the different ways that this happens. The most common method in role-playing games right now is you roll a die and you're trying to hit a target number. And if you get that number or higher on the die, you succeed. And that is used in the vast majority of systems. The only real question ever asked is, what die do I roll? And this is kind of important because when role-playing games were first coming out back in the early days, these lovely math rocks that we have all become so accustomed to and have started to obsess over and collect like little dice goblins that we are, or dice dragons if that's your preference, they did not exist in an easily obtainable fashion back in 1974. The earliest editions of the game were actually shipped with chits, cardboard chits that you would cut out, or maybe they were already cut out for you, I don't know. And you'd put them into a bag of some sort or a hat, and you'd draw a random chit out, and that would be the number that you rolled, so to speak, on your and this was important because that was the best way that they could manage at the time to have this random number selection, because the dice that they wanted to use, they couldn't get their hands on in large enough numbers to put them into the sets. They could not keep up with demand, because up until that time, while these types of dice did exist. They existed strictly as an aid for mathematics, for teachers, something to help teachers teach mathematics, and so the supply was not very large. That's my understanding, and it became very difficult for them to for the early companies to really do what they needed to do. Now, that does not apply to six-sided dice. My understanding is that six-sided dice were still relatively easy to get their hands on, much to the joy of people who play war games and people who play games by Steve Jackson, games like The Fantasy Trip or later GURPS, and other games that strictly stuck to a six-sided die for their mechanic. And they had a lot of an easier time because at that point board games and such were still a popular thing, and or even then, and it was probably a lot easier for the people to get six-sided dice. Most families at the time would probably have a game of Monopoly lying around, or could get a game of Monopoly and then take the two dice from that, and suddenly you've got the dice that you need to be able to play, say, Traveller, or I don't know if Traveller uses two six-sided dice. I'm sorry, I'm assuming. But you get the idea. The idea being just cannibalizing other games in order to get your dice. And that's what a lot of us did. I certainly did some of that when I was younger because I didn't have money to go to a game store. I didn't even know what a game store was when I started the hobby. I got my books from the library. Like, what the heck? I had to give them back. I couldn't keep them. Anyway, so these lovely math rocks, these beautiful, awesome math rocks that come in so many different shapes and sizes, are relatively new comparatively to other methods that we've used. But this is also where, back in the day, this was the idea. This is where it started. But that other idea of putting random chits into a bag and drawing them out, like, you can still do that. If you are a game creator and you want to make something that's unique, you can make a game that relies on chits, that little cardboard chits that you can have, punch out chits, or little tokens, or plastic little symbols or things, anything that you can have your players toss into a bag and they reach in and draw one out, as long as they all feel the same and there's no way to tactily tell the difference between one or the other, then it's a relatively straightforward method of getting a outcome. So that's one method, and then from there we get to the dice. And the most common one that we're familiar with now is the 20-sided die. And what's interesting about the 20-sided die, I'm not a mathematician. I'm not claiming to be a numbers guy. I don't have the background to tell you all the different probability stuff. But what I do know is that a 20-sided die is fun to roll. I know that. And I've learned that a 20-sided die is similar to a 100-sided die, except broken into 5% increments. So in a sense, every D20 system is a percentile die system, but with all the numbers broken down by 5% increments. Put that in a pipe and smoke it if you want. Please don't smoke inside unless that's cool in your area. I tease. Anyway, so the D20 die is the most common. That's the one that many systems use. Modiphius uses a 2D20 system where you roll two 20-sided die, and I think you keep like the highest or the low. I never played their games. I don't know. I just know it's a 2D20 system. Most versions of Dungeons and Dragons use the D20 die for the vast majority of resolutions, especially 3rd edition onwards. And that's when it became the D20 system, and almost everything except for damage was rolled on a 20-sided die. Other systems use 20-sided dice for other pieces of their mechanics. The Legendary Adventures uses the 20-sided die for damage rolls, which I think is pretty cool. and it's pretty common. It's out there. A lot of people use it at this point in time. If you are a gamer, chances are you own at least one 20-sided die somewhere in your collection. But that's not the only one that people have used, because other dice have been used to find that result, that yes, no, and by how much result. And the second most common one, in my experience, has been, if I can get this out of here. This is where I love, I wish I knew how to edit more, because then I could edit out me fiddling with this thing and say, oh yeah, it was really easy. It took me just one moment. Nope. And I just spilled a D4 onto my cat. I hope she didn't mind. All right, so I'm not going to get it out of there, but that's okay. It's the percentile die. The one, the, you know, two 10-sided dice. One of them marked with the tens, and the other marked with just ones. And you roll those together to get a number between 1 and 100, or yeah. Why that is important and why that is interesting. Here we go. Here we go. Oh, I got one, and now the other is being stubborn. There we go. Okay, so I can hold these up. Hopefully you can kind of see those in the camera. It's hard for me to tell. So those are percentile dice. Now, percentile dice are neat because the options for modifiers and different chances open up. You are no longer stuck with, well, a +1 or a +2 is like the most we should ever do for any one modifier. Now you're looking at, well, plus 5%, plus 3%, plus 1%. You can really kind of play with it a bit more, and you can have different modifiers coming from different locations all coming together to create this one, 50% chance or 27% chance or 69% chance or whatever percent chance you want. And then you make this roll, and that decides the outcome, whether or not that you're just trying to meet that percentage chance or roll higher, or if you want to record just how much higher you roll above that percentile chance in order to decide how awesome the success was. And that's kind of it's a neat way to do things. It really isn't that much different than rolling the D20, especially when you think about the D20 being just at 5% increments of a D100 of a percentile die. Where this breaks down, in my opinion, is it does require you to read 2 dice. And especially if you are someone with a visual impairment, that can sometimes take a little bit, because you got to look at one die. Yeah, that's a 70. And then you pick up the other die. Oh, that's a 6. And you got to make sure that line under or dot next to the 6 is clearly visible, because if that's a 6 or a 9, you need to know. And a lot of times you don't know. Unless you can see that dot or that line. And so I've had some dice where they didn't put that dot or line on there, and so I've had to explain to players that's a 6, not a 9, even though you're reading it like a 9, because that's a 6-sided die. It doesn't have 9 sides, and then they get upset. Like, I rolled a 9. Like, no, you didn't. You rolled a 6. So dice manufacturers, even when you're making a 6-sided die, please just put the dot next to the 6, because it saves some arguments. Make sure that it's big enough so that people who are rubbing their thumb on it can feel it. If you're making dice for other people, if you're making dice for yourself, do what you want. You're amazing. Go for it. I respect that ability to create. And anyway, so that's like it's a 2-step process. You're reading 2 different dice in order to add the number, or not add the numbers together, but put it together to get an outcome. And that's one way to do things. So that's the D20 and the D100. Pretty common. Now, The most common one that I run across, because I'm deeply steeped in the old school Renaissance. That's my preferred style of game to read. That's what I really enjoy playing. Not that I'm not familiar with other things, but that's kind of my sweet spot right now. And so the ones that I really like in that utilize the 20-sided die and the 6-sided die, and almost never use anything else. Now, the reason why I like that is because it is very simple. It's very hard for anyone even with a visual impairment, or even someone who is totally blind and they're based on tactile. You're never going to mistake the 20-sided die for the 6-sided die, because they both feel so different in the hand. Now, I have seen people mistake the 20-sided die for the 12-sided die, or hand me a 12-sided die thinking that's a 20-sided die. That happens more frequently than I'd care to mention with people with a visual impairment, because to them, the shapes are the same, and especially if they're new to the game, they're not going to know. And so you really have to pay attention when you're watching them roll their dice to make sure they're rolling the right die. But if you keep it to either a 20-sided die or a 6-sided die, that's much more tactily relevant, or not relevant, that's much more tactily distinct. That's the better word. And easier for them to tell. And that's kind of why I like it, because it also just ticks that neat little part of my brain that I don't have to worry about all the other die types, because I already know what everything is. So that's one thing. Another method of rolling dice that has emerged, or gaining an outcome for a game that has emerged, is the dice pool, where you're rolling a bunch of dice, the number of which are dictated by your character's abilities, and you are trying to see how many of those dice roll above a certain number. The most common use of this is the 6-sided die, and that's used both in some RPGs as well as in, say, war games, like the Warhammer games by Games Workshop use D6s, and a lot of other war games do as well. And what you do is you get your fistful of D6s as dictated by how many shots your troopers are firing, or how many times your guys are swinging their swords, and you roll those dice. And with role-playing games, it kind of works the same. It's especially where I most commonly have seen this one is in the World of Darkness system. I don't think they're using D6s anymore with that one, but I know at one point they did. At least I think they did. I never was big into World of Darkness, so someone who was can feel free to correct me on the type of die used, because it might have been a D8 or a D10 for all I know. But the idea was you had a set number of these dice as dictated by your character's ability and then their skill. And that would give you, say, 7. And you would pick up those 7 dice and you would roll them. And that happens in some other game systems as well. There's, I think the World of Darkness games are the most common users of that dice pool system that I'm aware of. Because I think Call of Cthulhu uses a percentile system, if I recall correctly. I haven't read Call of Cthulhu yet. I'm just going off of what I've seen on the internet, so I apologize if I'm getting your system wrong. I like the idea of the dice pool, of grabbing, because I've played Warhammer, so I have lots of D6s. I love the idea of grabbing a bunch of D6s and let's roll them all in the dice box and see what we get, and count up our successes and count up our failures, and compare the two, and the opponent rolls their pool of dice, and kind of just you have fun with it there. So that's another method that's entertaining. It's entertaining if you come from a wargaming background. Where that system falls down, though, is if you are trying to add modifiers to those. If you are strictly saying roll X number of dice, anything above a 4 is a success, or anything like 5 or higher is success, 4 or higher is success. That's relatively easy. But if you're looking at a system that is going to then say, you know, roll these dice and then add X to it and subtract Y or what have you, then that tends to get more complicated. People have to think more, and they're looking at the individual dice and they're like, oh, I don't know. And then, you know, it takes time. That's the main thing. It's not that it's hard. It's not that people don't want to do it. It just takes time at the table. Anytime you're using lots of dice, that just the amount of time it takes to calculate the end result is something to keep in mind when looking at different methods for solving that age-old question of, does my character succeed or not? I'm a fan of that idea. I still like it. I still like the dice pool system, but I really am big on minimizing modifiers and just having it be the number of dice you roll, and then anything above a 4 or higher is a success, and leaving it at that. I like that. That's how I would run, say, the Prince Valiant storytelling game, using that method instead of using the coins, because that's one method I'd never experienced before, using coins. Because really, if you look at a situation, it's pretty binary. Succeed, yes or no. So you'd think that a coin would be a great way to answer that, because there's only 2 sides to a coin. I looked at it, and I did a couple experimental coin tosses with that as an idea to see if maybe this is something I could use for a system of my own creation. And it works. But the logistics is interesting, because from the perspective of someone with a visual impairment, it's actually not that easy to quickly look at a bunch of coins that have just randomly landed in your dice tray and quickly see which one's heads, which one's tails. You almost have to get down closer to them, and that's because there's no contrast. A coin is one flat metallic surface, or one metallic surface, but with the embossment of the image on it that you need to be able to discern in order to see whether you got heads or tails. Now, someone with normal vision might be able to glance down and say, oh, 5 heads, you know, and you're good to go. But I know for me, I actually was getting to the point where I had to really get my head down close in order to look at my coins and figure out which one was heads or tails, especially if I was using pennies. I mean, I tried this with dollar coins and 50-cent pieces, and that worked a little bit better because they're so big. But at that point, they're also really big and heavy, and that didn't really make a lot of sense. Da-da-ch. But it's an option that's out there. And I don't want to poo-poo it too much. It's just the only other really limitation to it is how many people really carry coins around anymore. I don't, you know, just so many years ago, say 20 years ago, it was much more common to have a pocket full of change. And the idea of I can just reach into my pocket and pull out however many coins I need to be able to play this game is kind of a cool idea. Back in the 80s, I'm sure that was very common. People would be like, oh yeah, you know, like, let's play. Gosh, I can't believe I left my dice at home, but let's just dig out the pocket change and use that and toss it instead. But nowadays, almost everything seems, at least in my neck of the woods, almost everything seems to run off of cash, dollar bills, or credit cards, or debit cards, if you will. And the idea of carrying around a lot of coins for any reason seems a bit odd. Woo, excuse me. To the point where people actually buy specialty coins in order to use them in their RPGs to represent the currency in your RPG. And at first I was all for it. I thought, this is really cool. Like, all these fantasy designs, and they're so neat, and I love it. And I sat down and looked at it and said, I'm spending 20 bucks or 30 bucks in order to get a pile of metallic discs. I could just take $10 in change and have the same pile. I'm saving money, and I know that if someone walks off with it, I've only lost like 25 cents as opposed to someone walking off with these coins and now I've got to buy another set, which is going to cost me another 30 bucks. it's kind of funny. Now, not to disparage people that have made those things or people that buy them and use them. Please go ahead. I'm not telling you not to do that. I have a massive collection of plastic coins myself and some metallic coins that I use as tokens and inspiration points for Cypher System games and things because that it works. It's fun. I like the physical, visceral feeling of having that coin in my hand, especially for the Cypher System and experience points. I think that's fantastic. It gives someone a fidget at the table to mess with that doesn't take them away from the game. And in our modern world of smartphones, that's incredible because everyone's got a smartphone and it's so easy to just, I'm going to check my Facebook and so you're taken out of it. And so having those coins can be a really good thing. You have that fidget. So that part is interesting to me. But anyway, but that's enough about the coins and RPGs. Another method that people have used in the past is playing cards. Now, playing cards is something that was used in, I think it was Deadlands, original Deadlands before it was adopted by the Savage World system, used playing cards. And I can see the appeal because it's very, very thematic. I am not a fan personally, but that's mostly because I spent so long rolling dice. I think that if I had spent a long time dealing with playing cards, that I would probably be just as comfortable with that. It seems odd to me, but that's okay. But I mean, the idea of taking a standard deck of playing cards and designing a system in order to use that deck of playing cards to decide who succeeds in a battle. I mean, that's very solid, and there's no reason not to do that. They're easy to randomize. They're easy to shuffle. Decks of cards are easy to get your hands on. You just go. I mean, heck, I can find them at the dollar store. So that's another method that I think is kind of cool. But let's talk about my personal preferred method, and one that I have gotten some good results from, but at the same time one that I admit is flawed. And just because I like it doesn't mean that I'm immune to its flaws. And that is 3d6 instead of a d20. I've experimented with this with games for a few years now. The basic concept is this. You replace the 20-sided die with 3 6-sided dice. Why do you do this? Because we all roll up our ability scores for our characters for D&D style games using 3 6-sided dice. And I thought that's kind of neat because that's part of, sometimes it's 4 6-sided dice, drop the lowest, or whatever system you work out with your DM. And we put a lot of emphasis on that moment in character creation, or at least traditionally we have. That is the moment that makes or breaks your character. Everything kind of dovetails from there to decide if you're going to have a great character or not, is how well you do with those dice rolls. And there's a part of me that thought, well, that's neat, but why can't we make that matter more often? Why can't we get that feeling more often? And excuse me. And Fantasy Age does this. And I think GURPS does this as well. You use the 3 6-sided dice to create a bell curve in the numbers where you can kind of predict where they're most likely going to go. But at the same time, you really don't know. It's still random. And so what I would do is I would take Swords and Wizardry, Continual Light, and I wouldn't change anything else about the rules except that. Well, actually, there was something else that I decided to change in the end because I realized that armor classes, most characters who wanted to would start out with an armor class of at least 16 because you get chainmail and a shield. And that's really hard to get on 3 6-sided dice as a level 1 person. It's hard for the monsters, and it's hard for the players to against the monsters that have those things right off the bat. And I felt that that was a bit too much. I always like the idea of characters starting out with nothing and growing into their awesomeness. So I switched in my mind. I switched all around so that the fighter would start out with, say, leather armor and a shield, and then their weapon of choice, or leather armor, no shield, and a two-handed weapon of their choice. And then using the 3d6 with the bell curve, because leather armor gives you a armor class of 12 if you don't have a dexterity modifier. And then if you include that shield in there, then you're looking at 13, maybe 14 if your shields give +2 to the armor class. And what that does is it gives you an oomph to that fighter character where, you're rolling 3 6-sided dice and you're most likely to get results between 9 and 12. And if your armor class is like 12 or higher, then it's much less likely that you're going to get hit, especially at low levels. But at the same time, that armor class still matters because a lot of rolls are going to run into that area between 9 and 12. And so an armor class of 11 or 12 still gets a lot of use. And you're not going to feel like you're kind of useless or in that sense. And I like that because to me it seems more appropriate than people saying, well, leather armor is useless because the modifier is so low and you can't, it's so easy to roll higher than that, and blah, 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 blah. And so people don't like leather armor. They think it's cheap and only for people that have to only wear leather armor. So I kind of, even though leather armor itself didn't exist in history, I kind of like the idea of the leather or the cloth armor that is created over layers and is really a very effective thing. The gambeson was a cloth armor and was highly effective as medieval armor, especially against arrows. And I like the idea of this concept of this change making a gambeson useful again, making a gambeson or a cloth armor or leather armor something that people would want to have, even if they couldn't have their chainmail, because it's still the most likely, the one that's going to stop the majority of the blows. And that's kind of what I did. And I also, I didn't modify the saving throws too much because it was pretty easy to get bonuses and modifiers to saving throws, and so those kind of worked out. And beginning level characters failed a lot of saves. Part of that mitigating that was just not having a lot of saves that they needed to roll, or keeping the ones that they needed to roll being relatively non-deadly. Just roll or be sick, roll or be blinded, roll or whatever, like little things you can throw at people that are temporary and going to keep them from getting won't debilitate them, but will maybe keep them out of the fight for 1 or 2 rounds, or give them a -1 modifier in their next attack roll. And that kind of worked with that until they get to be a bit higher level, and then you can start really throwing the the save or die stuff at them. Excuse me. So for me, 3 6-sided dice is really cool. Now, the downside to 3 6-sided dice is simple. You have to sit there and read all 3 dice and add them together. That doesn't sound like much, but it does take time. And especially if you're working with people that have a visual impairment or people that might have a cognitive difference in them and how they process information, it might take them a little bit longer to do that. And than it would be to, say, read one 20-sided die that they've rolled and then tell you what that number is. And then you can figure out how to process their modifiers. So that's a limitation to 3d6. And that's one reason maybe not to use 3 6-sided die, is if you're worried about people being able to do that math quickly on the fly. So we've covered 3d6, we've covered dice pools, we've covered the standard d20, we've covered the percentile die, we've covered decks of cards, we've covered coins. Those are all methods that can be used to decide whether or not your character succeeds in their actions. And when you're designing a role-playing game, or even just putting together a bunch of concepts, then you should be paying attention to what method you want to use. I personally lean towards the 3d6 because it creates a bell curve. It creates that predictability without necessarily guaranteeing it. Some people, there's a diceless role-playing system. I have never read it. I can't say anything about it. I just know it exists. Amber Diceless Role-Playing is the name of the system, that, as far as I'm aware. And that's supposed to work fairly well as well. One other dice system that I've encountered, which I like, I have a love-hate relationship with it, is the die step system. And this is kind of what Savage Worlds uses. The Eldritch role-playing game by Dan Cross uses a version of this as well. And that is, the first time I encountered it was with the Dragon Strike role-playing game. I'm not saying that this was the first time it was used. I'm just saying it's the first time I personally encountered it. And what that is each of the dice in your set of, your 7 math rocks, each one of these dice is used individually. And what you do is your ability, instead of your ability being a number, your ability is the die. So let's say, like, I really am absolutely horrible at dexterity. My character is the worst klutz, like the worst. They should not be in a dungeon, they're so klutzy. So they would have a d4 dexterity. And what that would mean is whenever they wanted to try something with dexterity, they'd have to roll the d4. And depending on how they rolled would be whether or not they succeeded. And there usually is a target number. And the target number maybe doesn't really change all that much. It just depends on what die you are rolling in your ability. Because if you level up your d4 to a d6, then you're more likely to succeed. And then you level up again from a d6 to a d8, from a d8 to a d10, from a d10 to a d12. Now, typically, the d12 is the best die in a die step system. The majority of systems out there will transition from using a d12 to say, well, now you can roll a d12 and a d4 or a d12 and a d6, because some of these systems don't use the d4. And then you go from there. You're rolling. Maybe you add those together, or you don't. I think Eldritch, you add them together. You get like they kind of do the Eldritch role-playing game by Dan Cross uses a combination of the die step system and the dice pool. You create your pool by adding together the die that you get for your ability plus the die you get for your skill or your specialization or your mastery sorry. So you can end up rolling as many as, I want to say, 3 dice. I think maybe 4. It's been a while. I think it's just 3. And the type of die is dependent upon how skilled your character is at both the base ability of the skill, plus if the specialization, and then the base ability, the training, and then the specialization or the mastery. And so you could have, like, say, a D12 in your athletics, or your it's your athletics, a D6 with your swords, with your swords, and then a D8 with your mastery of the longsword or the arming sword. And then you would roll all 3 of those dice, add them up, and that gives you your result. And you compare that to the target number of whatever you're trying to defeat. And if memory serves, that's how Eldritch Role-Playing Game by Dan Cross works. That one, and I'm mentioning his name because I know there's other Eldritch RPGs out there, or another RPG named Eldritch, and I want people to understand which one I'm talking about. I'm not trying to name drop or anything. I am a fan of his work. I have several copies of it over there. It's cool. We'll talk about that in another video. That's one way of doing the dice step system. The Savage Worlds, they have it where it's just you get 1 die in your ability, and then you roll that 1 die versus the target number, and then start adding modifiers. And it's a lot like the D20 system, like that. You just use a different die type for different things. A system that I've thought of that I kind of like is basically you are rolling your die versus a target number, but the target number never changes. And when you get a bonus or a negative modifier, instead you change out the die that you're rolling. So, for example, if you normally had a strength of D10, and then you drink a strength potion, then the next time you try to use your strength, as long as the potion is still active, you now are rolling a D12 instead of a D10. But the target number is still only like 6, or 8, or 4, or whatever this target number was decided upon by the creator of the system. I like that because it allows for the use of the odd die types. Because there's actually a lot of dice out there that don't get normally used, and that is I'm talking about your D14s, your D16s, your D18s, your D22s, your D24s, your D26s, your D28s, and the D30. These dice all exist. They are out there to be found. A lot of them are made by Impact Miniatures, thanks to some Kickstarters that they've done, which I've backed those Kickstarters, and I have samples of those dice in my dice bags. I'm not going to get them out right now because they're really confusing. And that's kind of like, they're really neat, and I really love the idea of these dice. The idea is amazing because a die step system that utilizes every die type from a D4 all the way to a D30 is kind of like my dream. I made that system. I built it from the ground up, keeping things simple, but keeping to that core concept. And I've been working on it for like more than 20 years now, trying to get it to work properly. And I finally have come to the conclusion that I don't think I can. And it's not because the math doesn't work. The math works. The main thing, people were saying, well, there's not enough of an increase between a D14 and a D16. Like, why would you bother with that? Why would you bother at all? Just go straight to the D20. And I said, no, because the math does work. Because what it is it's like training in a martial art. You start out, and every level that you achieve, every belt that you achieve in the beginning is a massive step. It is huge. It is hard to get, but it is a significant step in your training because it shows significant increases in your ability. Whereas once you get to, say, a black belt, or once you get to a certain level, the differences between that And going beyond, they're harder for the average person to detect. It's kind of like diminishing returns, although I don't mean that in a disparaging way. But it's harder for the uninitiated to know the difference. Now, anyone who's initiated or anyone who's really skilled in it is going to look at that and say, oh, that person's really, really good, when they see that little something that person does that separates them from the person that's at the level below them. And so in my mind, anything beyond the D12 is kind of like that. You're continuing to grow, you're continuing in small increments to get better, and you use that skill to allow yourself to do fancy things. And so that's what the system that I designed did. Is you say you had a D16 in your sword ability, but you wanted to use that sword swipe to hit more than one opponent. Well, then you would lower your D16 to a D14, and then your roll would potentially hit 2 opponents if they were sitting next to each other. And you kind of controlled it that way. Or you'd say, I really want, I'm dueling this one character, and if I use the best of my abilities, I can definitely score a hit on them. I can get past their defenses, but maybe it won't be a strong hit. It might be a little light. So I want to instead sacrifice some of my finesse to make my blows more damaging. I'm not going to be as finessey as I could be, because I just want to kill them. And so you would go from, say, I want to go from D16 back down to D12. That's 2 die steps. But now my attack is going to deal triple damage if it hits. So that's a way of you as a player being able to control what your character does and doesn't do, using the die step system, using all these odd numbers of dice to be able to do a lot of stuff. I love that system, and I still may produce it at some point, but there is one significant flaw. And that flaw is this. It's not even a problem with the math, like I said before. It's a logistical problem. One, you've got to get all those different sized dice. Now that's doable. You have to order them online, because most game stores aren't going to carry them. But maybe you can ask your game store to order them. And Dungeon Crawl Classics actually has they've licensed Impact to do these dice in sets of these dice for their game, and that's an easy way to get your hands on it. Is just ask for the Dungeon Crawl Classic set. But when you're at the table, one thing I found out through my playtesting, especially with playtesting with people that didn't know me ahead of time and just kind of came in for a playtest to try out a new system, they had a hard time, a very difficult time, telling the difference between the larger dice at the table, to know when to, it wasn't a question of when do I roll the D22 versus a D24. The question was, how do I tell the difference between a D22 and a D24? How do I tell the difference between a D16 and a D18? And when you have all the dice the same color, like most of us do, we get a dice set. Those differences become very much smaller. It's like trying to tell the difference between a D12 and a D20 for someone who's blind, like I talked about earlier in this video. Unless you know what to look for, or you're really skilled with it, you can't. It's easy to make that mistake. And sometimes I find myself still making that mistake when I'm reaching into a bag without looking. And with this die step, that becomes exasperated. It's much more significant. Now, the way to get around it would be to make sure that when you order your dice, each die step is a different color. And that can work. And that would be the way that if I was to do it again, if I was to try to, set this up again, I would have that set up and have that written into the rules of, make the D16 the periwinkle die, or the blue die, or whatever color you want to do it, and do it that way. excuse me, but I've tangented enough. There's enough of a tangent. That is the significant problem with that die step system, and that's what I ran into. But if someone else thinks that they can solve that one and they want to take this die step system and run with it and have fun with it, then I'm not offended by it. I doubt you'll ever create the exact same thing that I made. But there's one more system out there that I've encountered recently that I thought was really interesting. And I don't know, haven't played the game itself. The game is called Iron Claw, and it's a game that focuses on anthropomorphic animals doing human-like things in a setting that is very much like the city-states of Italy during the Renaissance. A bit of an odd duck of a setting, very different, but at the same time, it has that swashbuckling feel to it that is kind of interesting. But the thing that caught my attention was the resolution mechanic that they use. What they did is they've done a die pool system combined with a die step system, similar to what Eldritch did, that I talked about before. But instead of adding the numbers together, you keep the numbers as they are, but you compare the results. So your highest result on your roll, no matter what die it is, doesn't matter the die, just matters the final number. So if you roll a 1 on that d20, but a 6 on a d6, then the 6 on the d6 is your highest number. You compare that highest number to the highest number that your opponent rolls if you're doing an attack, or they roll for their defense. And they get their pool of dice from various sources that can be d20s or d12s or d4s or d8s or whatever. And so you compare highest to highest, and whoever rolled higher, gets the point or doesn't get the point, or whatever the case may be. So if you're attacking and their highest rolled defense die is higher than your highest damage die, then they blocked that part of the damage. But if your next highest one is higher than their next highest one, then that one went through. And you kind of go down the line comparing all the numbers until somewhere there's a die that either there's no dice left, or you've got one die and they don't have a die to block it with, or they have a blocking die and you don't have an attack die, whatever. And that is used for pretty much any time that you're going against an opponent's abilities, or if you're just going against a target number, then the number of successes that you need is set by the game master, and you're rolling your different die types in your pool in order to try to figure out how many successes you get versus a target number. What I like about this is it uses the die step, and that's cool, but it keeps the idea of a target number that doesn't move. As far as I can tell, the target number doesn't move for the most part, at least for standard rolls. It keeps that, so the die steps matter. But then also, if you're comparing highest to highest, that's an interesting way to do it, which I kind of like, because on the one hand, it doesn't require a lot of math. You're not adding or subtracting. You're just comparing numbers. And so that should go by fast. But it does require you to actually compare numbers with your opponent and think. And so that will slow things down. I'm a bit torn about it. I like it as an idea. I'm really fascinated by it. I want to see how it plays out. But I can see the limitations to the system. At least according to how much time it's going to take to resolve a combat round. And that's something that a lot of reviewers have commented on, that combat does take a while because there's a lot of different ways to achieve stuff, and there's a different and it just takes time. Now that's no different than D20 in 5th edition. The D20 game, 5th edition D&D, combat takes time because you're comparing a lot of numbers and a lot of stuff. All of these dice systems that I've talked about, all these different resolution mechanics, they all take time. The goal of the game ought to be, how can we have a resolution system that allows us to figure out what we need to know and have it not take that much time? Have it take as little time as possible to get from can I do the thing to yes or no. And I think that is why D20 systems in general are so popular. Because ultimately, you're rolling one die and you're getting a number and you're comparing that to a target number. And that is fast. Now, it can take time to add up modifiers in games like Pathfinder or 5th edition, where there's a lot of modifiers to add together, or 3.0 and 3.5 were hellacious for this as well. That can take time. Those parts of the system are where the weeds are. That's where things can get a bit crazy. But the essence of it remains the same. It's one die being rolled to get a number between 1 and 20, and whether or not you succeed is based on the number that you get. And that is where a lot of other D20 based systems or systems that use 20-sided dice, they also succeed because, like the Cypher system, there's modifiers in the Cypher system, but they're not nearly as many modifiers, and each one of them is a lot easier to handle than in, say, D20, because you don't have to question about whether or not grappling is going to, or this instance of grappling gets you a +2 or a +3, or is it +1? What was your proficiency modifier again? Oh, I don't remember. Oh gosh, we leveled up and now it's +3, and usually it's +2, and you're doing all that. With Cypher's system, every modifier comes in a step, and each step is essentially a plus or a -3. So it doesn't matter how many, it doesn't matter where you're getting that modifier from. It's going to be a +3 modifier or a -3 modifier to the target number. That's it. So that's why, of the D20 systems, my favorite is the Cypher system, because it uses that 20-sided die to get that fast resolution, but it also gives us those modifiers that are easy to apply. But among the D&D systems, the one that I like the most is still Swords and Wizardry Continual Light, because it has the 20-sided die for that quick resolution. There's fewer modifiers. Most of the modifiers end up being only a +1 or +2 at tops, and you're easily written on your character sheet to keep track of. And you can roll your 20-sided die for your attack or your whatever you're doing, plus your 6-sided die for damage at the same time. And that's all you need to do. It's just the 2 dice. And so we're kind of bringing this back to the beginning when I talk about what dice systems I really enjoy. And so I know this has been a long rambling video. Kind of was intended to be, but probably has turned out a little bit longer than it needed to be. I apologize, but I hope someone got something fun out of it, learning about the different systems that are out there and the different ways that they are viewed by someone who is not necessarily a mathematician. I'm not into statistics, but I want to talk about what I think is fun and what I don't. I think peak fun right now for me remains the 20-sided die. As much as I would love it to be the 3 6-sided dice, and as much as that is my favorite rules-wise, fun-wise, you don't beat the D20. You can't, because many of us who play D&D for so long have it ingrained in our heads to look for that natural 20. And there's nothing quite like that moment of rolling that natural 20, even though it's only a 5% chance, just like every other individual number on the die. It's really, there's nothing special about the 20 or the 1. They're all just both of those are just a 5% chance, just like anything else. We might as well have criticals happen on a 10, because you're just as likely to roll a 10 as you are to roll a 20 or a 1. It doesn't matter on the D20. That's why I find it hilarious that even me, who understands this, who thinks about this, and I still get giddy at the thought of rolling that D20 and getting that natural 20 when I'm attacking with my barbarian. It's weird. It makes no sense, but it still remains the kind of gold standard for role-playing games. And so there's a lot of other stuff out there. There's a lot of other systems you can use. We've talked about a lot of other systems. Don't grab a different method of solving your problems in your system just because. You know, make sure that it serves a purpose. Make sure it does something. Make sure it matters to how you want the system to be played. If you just want something to solve your problems and you don't want to sit there and do a lot of craziness, then I do recommend using a D20 based system. If for no other reason than because for the vast majority of people out there, they're already going to have one, and it will be familiar to them, and you're not going to have them confused. So there's the end of my long ramble about different dice systems and how I feel about them. I hope that this was useful for someone, even if it was just entertaining to listen to me contradict myself sometimes. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to leave a like or subscribe if you enjoy this sort of thing. If you want to hear me ramble on about different other mechanics and skill systems and whatnot, I'd be happily do that. Just let me know. Otherwise, the next video I shoot, I intend to be the Cypher System character creation video once again, once I get it completely set up to do the next character. And then from there, maybe we'll do a solo play of the Cypher System, because I really like that system and I want to start showing it off a little bit more. Also, I will likely not be doing any videos later this week because I am going to be going out of town. And I will not be available. I mean, I might be available to do something from a different location. We'll see. But I'm not planning on it. So just FYI, if I'm quiet for a few more days, that's why. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you again for stopping by. Peace be with you. Bye-bye.